Good morning. It is Tuesday, December 29th, 2020. I'm Pastor Thor Ramsey with Center Church. This is Gospel for Five, where we take 5 minutes out of our day and focus on the gospel because Jesus is the gospel. We've been going over Paul's letter to the Galatians and how that covers the gospel. We're in chapter 5. We're really recapping the first few verses in chapter 5. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Key point. We're set free for freedom, to be free. Stand firm, therefore. Stand firm in what? Well, stand firm in the gospel. The gospel, again, being you're saved by grace plus nothing. That is the gospel. Stand firm in that. And do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Again, the whole issue in Galatians is these Judaizers coming in and saying to these Galatians, in order to be a true Christian, you must add this to grace. Believing in Jesus plus this physical act you must do, or this physical thing, or whatever it happens to be. This law you must follow. So stand firm in grace. Stand firm in the gospel itself. Stand firm in Jesus Christ, who is the gospel. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, if you accept this addition to the gospel, Christ will be of no advantage to you. Why? Because you're really going to depend upon this thing you think you should do or must do in order to be accepted by God. And the gospel teaches, in order to be accepted by God, you accept Christ. And once you're in Christ, you're accepted by God. Stand firm in the truth of the gospel. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. So once you put yourself under the law and say, this is what I must do to be acceptable to God, then you must do everything in order to make yourself acceptable to God. In other words, it's not just one thing in the law that makes a person acceptable to God, but all things in the law that make a person acceptable to God. So don't just think you can follow the one thing and be acceptable and neglect other things. If you want to be acceptable to God on the basis of the law, then follow the whole law. That's the idea. You are severed from Christ, you who would be justified by the law. You're severed from Christ. You're not depending upon Christ. You're depending upon the law. So you're severed from Christ. You're not depending upon him. So you're looking to be declared not guilty by your behavior by following the law, not by being in Christ. You have fallen away from grace. The gospel is grace plus nothing. Jesus plus nothing is the gospel. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. So there are two types of righteousness biblically. Again, there is the actual lived righteousness, and that is our behavior. But where does that behavior come from? It comes from the imputed righteousness that God gives us. He gifts us the righteousness of Christ. In other words, he sees us as if we were as righteous as Jesus Christ this very second. Hard for most of us to get around. Why? Because our behavior is often not righteous. Our behavior is often unrighteous. Even though generally Christians want to be good citizens, they want to be good neighbors, they want to be good people, but we're still sinners, right? Why? Well, here's the thing. We live as if we're our old man or our old woman. We live as if we're still under the rule and reign of sin when we've been gifted the righteousness of Christ. In believing, rather than living as if we're orphans, living out that old nature, we live in the new creation that God has made us, then we actually live out, right? But we have this hope that one day we will be, not just in terms of our position with God, but actually in our actions toward God and everyone else, truly righteous. And that is the hope of righteousness, I would say, which is the next life. You'll never be truly that in this life. If you were, that's perfectionism. And we'll never be perfect in this life. But through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. Now, what has God said to you today? What are you going to do